NewsRadio was a workplace sitcom ahead of its time. At first glance, it may seem perfectly at home in the 90s, being set in a New York radio station before the internet would change the media landscape forever, but NewsRadio flouted conventional norms seen on its sitcom contemporaries, in ways both small and large, ways we also take for granted today. During its run, it struggled to find an audience as it bounced around the TV schedule, though it did develop a small, loyal following, and its impact can be seen in the many shows that would recreate its mix of workplace dynamics with a touch of the absurd. The story of NewsRadio begins with its creator, Paul Simms. He began his career writing for Late Night with David Letterman, and then later he would go on to be a writer on the critically acclaimed sitcom The Larry Sanders Show on HBO. The success of that program raised his profile, and he struck a development deal with the production company Brillstein Gray Entertainment. And it was shortly after that deal he came up with the idea for what would become NewsRadio. Although Brillstein Gray was connected to ABC, that network passed on the idea for the series, opening the door to NBC, where it was considered a much better fit, as NBC was at the time looking for smart, adult-oriented comedy, much like other NBC hits at the time, Seinfeld and Friends. Paul Simms' reputation got the attention of then NBC president of entertainment, Warren Littlefield, a man responsible for helping launch some of NBC's most iconic comedies, from Cheers to Seinfeld to Will and Grace. Littlefield later on revealed that part of the reason the show was improved was largely based on his desire to work with Simms, believing his voice would reach the young adult demographic that NBC was currently pursuing.
This guy, his sensibility is going to go right to our target audience. So I must say, I can tell you this now, you kind of had me before you even pitched the show.
The rough idea for NewsRadio was an inversion of the setting seen on Friends and Seinfeld, where the characters are most typically found in their homes or in social settings. Instead, NewsRadio would place the characters in the workplace as a general meeting space for all the characters. The office setting was inspired in part by Paul Simms' experience working in offices throughout his time in show business, although he didn't want to choose an industry that was exactly like his, so he instead opted to make the setting a New York radio station. Of course, the workplace sitcom was not a new idea at the time, but this particular version of it would de-emphasize the work in favor of focusing on the interpersonal dynamics of the characters. NewsRadio is rarely about radio, and even more rarely about the news. Rather, the radio station's concerns tended to be about the broader experience of working in an office, with many of the concerns the crew faces being relatively generic office concerns like bonuses and budget concerns. Instead, the show decided to emphasize how people make connections within the workplace, whether they want to or not, creating a sort of makeshift family. The series was put together very quickly. It went from pitch to filming the first episode in about 3 months, a remarkably quick turnaround time for a network sitcom. Part of that reflects a degree of freedom that was given to Simms on the series, and part of that freedom included assembling an ensemble cast. The lead for the series, Dave Nelson, was written for Dave Foley. Foley first came to fame in the Canadian sketch comedy series, The Kids in the Hall.
You're thinking this guy's just some right-wing paranoid reactionary who had a horrible upbringing and whose father beat him every day with a Bible. Well, maybe that's true, but it never did me any harm.
Simms met Foley at an Emmy party and wanted to cast him in a role, though he didn't contact Foley again until he had written the script for NewsRadio. In the meantime, Foley had accepted a role in another sitcom, much to Simms' disappointment, but luckily, Foley was fired from that other series, which freed him up to do NewsRadio. Dave Nelson is the freshly hired news director at WNYX, moving to New York from his previous home in Wisconsin.
He's like me, looks too young and is a little bit too nervous.
Although he has an unassuming politeness about him, Dave is also a capable and competent news director.
Here's the Philadelphia 76ers. The Philadelphia 76ers. Played a game of basketball today. Here's Bill McNeil to tell you all about it.
The next character Paul Simms had cast in his mind was Bill McNeil, which he had created for actor Phil Hartman. Probably most well known for his time on The Simpsons, you might remember Phil Hartman from the roles of Troy McClure, Lionel Hutz, and Miguel Sanchez. But it was Hartman's time on Saturday Night Live that made him a hot commodity in the first half of the 90s.
Well, she certainly is beautiful enough to be a princess. Say, you gonna finish these fries?
Hartman had been considering leaving SNL at that time, but to keep him there, NBC had offered him the chance to pitch his own series. However, when he saw the script for NewsRadio, Hartman began to reconsider, as he was impressed by it. It was the advice from one of his former SNL castmates, Dana Carvey, who suggested to Hartman that he'd be happier as part of an ensemble rather than running his own show. Phil Hartman was so well suited to Bill because his distinct voice sounded as if it had come right off the radio.
I feel like I can be believable in this role. With traffic and weather together every 12 minutes, this is WNYX News Radio. You know, that's believable.
Bill McNeil was the pompous and often silly anchor of WNYX. His love for himself is only matched by the contempt he has for everyone else.
Is Matthew getting fired?
No.
No decision yet, Matthew.
Maura Tierney played Lisa Miller. Although one of the central characters in the series, she was also one of the last to be hired. Before Tierney was cast, Lisa was originally meant to be Hispanic, though they struggled to find the right person for the role, so they had to expand their search. At the time, Tierney had appeared in a handful of small roles, but NewsRadio would be her biggest so far. She almost didn't get the role after she was forced to re-audition because the casting director had accidentally erased her tape. However, when she did audition, it was so impressive that she was flown from New York to Los Angeles for another in-person audition. She was then offered the role and walked straight into a rehearsal that very same day.
She sort of watches, and if somebody's getting a little out of control, I think she sort of can take them down a peg. In a funny way, in a nice way.
Lisa, seemingly the only WNYX journalist who's capable of doing their job, is the most serious member of the ensemble. But she's also got a quiet, biting sense of humor that shows up on occasion.
I mean, I have never...
Done it in the office while everyone else is out to lunch?
Yeah.
Me neither.
Well, where do we go from here?
News booth?
In addition to Dave Foley and Phil Hartman, the other actor Paul Simms had in mind for the series while writing it was Andy Dick, who would be cast as Matthew Brock. Andy Dick was a relative newcomer, having only prominently appeared on the Ben Stiller show in the early 90s. Simms had been impressed with Dick on the show, and Dick, on his part, had urged Simms to write him into one of his projects. When we first meet Matthew, he's a very skittish, emotionally charged presence in the office. Over time, Matthew would adopt more of Andy Dick's personality and would grow to be the strangest person in the office. His childlike perspective of the world was often paired with a tendency to fall on his ass.
Back in August, I ate a donut that I found under the conference table. Am I gonna die?
Vicki Lewis was cast in the role of Dave's secretary, Beth. Although she had already appeared in several roles on sitcoms, including Seinfeld and Home Improvement, it was her time on stage in the show Damn Yankees that impressed James Burrows, the director for the first few episodes of NewsRadio. Vicki Lewis auditioned for the character in a way that was a little more thoughtful than the other women who auditioned for the role. Whereas they approached Beth as being a bit ditzy, Lewis presented her as someone a bit more savvy and clever.
Beth strikes me as somebody who's had just a little tiny bit too much therapy.
Beth was the snarky secretary who came from a slightly more offbeat world. Although there was a running joke that she had no last name in the series, years after it ended, Lewis would reveal that Paul Simms had told her Beth's secret last name, Hightower, a very fancy name that evokes the sound of someone upper class, to contrast the very not upper class Beth.
Coffee, Dave?
Oh, yes, please.
Right, it's over by the booth.
Stephen Root was cast as WNYX's eccentric billionaire owner, Jimmy James. Although he would go on to be a big star, at this time, Root was mostly working as a character actor, appearing in small roles in TV and film. During casting, he was slightly younger than how the character was written, but in the audition, his unique take won over the creative team. Root brought an almost flippant energy to Jimmy James that captured the essence of a boss too busy to care about his employees.
It's great fun to be able to play a guy who can come in and go, "Hi, what's everybody doing?" "Now that's great, I gotta go."
Jimmy would become increasingly silly as the series rolled on, as his eccentricities often pulled the WNYX crew into his antics.
But what you put me through today was a test.
Could be. Or it could be I'm just making it all up as I go along.
Well, which is it?
You'll never know.
Although you can see them in the pilot episode, 2 roles would be recast with new actors. Candy Alexander, who would become the new Catherine Duke, the news anchor who worked alongside Bill McNeil. Before NewsRadio, Alexander had a few supporting roles in productions, including CB4, Poetic Justice, and Sugar Hill. Although Ella Joyce was originally cast as Catherine, it was thought that a stronger personality was needed to contrast with Phil Hartman's Bill McNeil, and Alexander was considered a better foil. Catherine was a very sharp personality, easily making an impression with a few lines, though often underutilized compared to other members of the crew.
So what's the big bonus, you guys?
No. You can drop it, Kathy. He's gone.
Sorry, gang. I guess you just gotta know how to play the game, honey.
The second late addition to the principal cast was Joe Rogan, who played the station electrician Joe Gorelli. This role would be one of Rogan's first major breaks in television, as he had recently moved to Los Angeles after spending a few years working as a stand-up comedian in the northeastern U.S. The role of the electrician was one of the trickier ones to cast. Originally, it went to Ray Romano, but he was let go as his performance didn't mesh well with the rest of the cast. For the pilot, Greg Lee was brought in to temporarily play the role of Rick, though he was never meant to be a permanent part of the cast. Eventually, the role would go to Rogan, and the character's name was changed from Rick to Joe. Greg Lee would go on to host Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and Ray Romano, of course, would go on to star in Everybody Loves Raymond. Joe Rogan brought a jockish persona to the character, and over time he would inspire the writers to give Joe a tendency towards believing in conspiracy theories and creating oddball inventions.
Do you love a good party, Joe? That's why I went to college, sir.
The cast meshed together very quickly and had an easy chemistry.
The first couple of days, it was very easy, and there was a strong camaraderie and I think a good rhythm.
That flow would be essential as NewsRadio was driven by the strength of its ensemble and the giving nature of their performances. The first episode in the series, titled Pilot, premiered on Tuesday, March 21st, 1995, sandwiched between Wings and Frasier. NewsRadio begins with Dave Nelson arriving in New York City to assume the role of news director at WNYX. His new boss, Jimmy, tasks him with the unenviable first assignment of firing the previous news director, Ed Harlow, played by Kurt Fuller.
You want me to fire Ed?
Well, it is in your contract, hiring, firing, what have you. Come on, I want you to meet the gang.
One of the interesting parts about the pilot's script is that the characters don't really tell jokes. This is key to the show's style of comedy. It arose from interactions rather than one-liners and zingers, unlike some other sitcoms at the time. It also had a very fast and fluid pace, a great fit for a radio newsroom. The pilot differs in some key ways from what the series would become. Aside from two of the characters being recast, some other notable changes were that a production booth would eventually transform into a break room, and the number of extras and ambient noise would all decrease as the series went along. One constant that was unique to NewsRadio was the giant recording booth in the back half of the set. The only change there is the growing number of cigar labels you can see on the control panel that were added by Phil Hartman throughout the years. The plot centers around Dave struggling to find a way to tell Ed that he's fired. Although the rest of the office is aware of Dave being their new boss, Ed thinks he's the new sports guy, and when he fires Dave after a bad performance, the tables turn very quickly.
Get the hell out of here, you're fired!
Huh? I think if you go in your office, I can explain.
This ought to be good.
There's a really nice line that helps establish one of the themes of the series.
It is still a very sad thing when a member of the family has to be terminated.
This is about a workplace family, and also steeped in the oxymoron of that term. You can't really terminate someone in your family as easily as you can fire an employee. But nonetheless, that feeling of family is just something that seems to come naturally when the right mix of people have to work together. As the episode ends, Dave establishes himself as a boss who won't be the bumbling dad the others imagined him to be.
Why? Because I'm the boss, Bill. That's why. That's why, Bill. And I will not be manipulated, I will not be contradicted, and I will not be intimidated.
The pilot for NewsRadio was filmed very quickly, and according to NBC Entertainment president Warren Littlefield, the network was very pleased with it.
And he goes, "Do you have any notes?" And I went, "Well, no, actually, I really loved what I saw." And he goes, "I think it's time for a margarita."
Brad Isaacs, a writer for the show, reflected on the pilot filming, saying, "There's a story that I think is true, and that's when they were shooting the pilot. Warren Littlefield was sitting next to Brad Gray, whose company, Brillstein Gray, managed a piece of the show. After the first or second scene was shot, Warren turned to Brad and said, 'We'll pick it up for 6 episodes,' which is really unusual. The debut episode of NewsRadio had nearly 18 million people watching, and its first season would average a bit over 11 million. At the time, it made for a modest success, but in the present day, that would be a massive hit for a network sitcom. And with its format and premise, a network sitcom about a radio station, NewsRadio is effectively presenting two media sectors that were huge in that time period, but are certainly shrinking in the present. In those ways, NewsRadio really reflects a specific moment in time. Its format, subject matter, and scale for success are a complete disconnect from the media world we inhabit nearly 30 years later.
This one I like, I keep.
The WNYX crew is a tightly knit bunch, and their squabbling very much resembles family bickering. We can see more of their family dynamic in the episode titled Big Day, where we see the staff competing with one another for a bonus, and how little some of them want to share.
It reeks of communism. It penalizes the person who most deserves the bonus, and speaking as that person, I cannot support it.
More fretting over presents and gifts is seen in Xmas Story, when Jimmy's generosity creates some sore feelings about who gets what, or more specifically, pity for Matthew, who got some tapes when the rest of the staff got brand new Miatas.
We're trying to figure out what to do about Matthew.
Oh, well, I was hoping it would never come to this, but I think you should fire him.
We later find out Matthew didn't just get tapes, but the rights to the old radio show on the tapes, so it wasn't as bad as it looked. In these episodes, we see Jimmy as the patriarch of the company and the pseudo-family, handing out gifts to reward his kids at the radio station. But this isn't some lovely, benevolent relationship. Jimmy is using these people to make money, making the family dynamics seem ridiculous when you consider that goal. The ridiculousness is a little clearer in the episode titled The Cane, where we see how Jimmy and Dave have conflicting approaches to management. Jimmy wants to see conflict among his workers, as he believes it leads to greater productivity.
You see the value in non-competitive cooperation.
Well, yes.
All right, well, that may work wonders in the bedroom, but I tell you what, do me a favor, keep that kind of crap out of my office.
That's the same philosophy Jimmy uses towards bonuses in the Big Day episode I mentioned earlier.
You know, the big bonus and the shaft. Now, I think that's just going to generate an atmosphere of paranoia and fear in the office. I see.
Thinking of Jimmy as a boss-like father is a twisted way of imagining fatherhood. A father shouldn't look to their kids as resources to extract labor out of. And that's part of what makes NewsRadio work as a comedy. It's taking this very common theme of a workplace family and demonstrating how awful that idea is, particularly in the early seasons where Jimmy doesn't even seem to care about the employees who seem to have a lot more affection towards him, as evidenced by the Christmas gifts they exchange in the Xmas episode, giving Jimmy a collectible baseball jersey from one of his favorite players, whereas he gave them goofy hats. The fancier gifts he gave instead were meant as a way to make amends for that. As the series progresses, we see Jimmy start to develop real feelings towards his staff, but the core of their relationship is still one where he has power over their fate that goes beyond a father raising children to be in the world. He holds their very livelihoods in his hands. Dave, in contrast, is a far kinder boss. Maybe it's because as the news director, Dave also works for Jimmy and doesn't have the immense privilege of being a billionaire who can get away with treating people like playthings that reward you with profit. Dave is the face of that middle step between management and ownership, the softer edge to blunt the harshness of Jimmy, or as we saw in the pilot, to take the heat for stuff Jimmy doesn't want to do. And the role of being that manager is explored in episodes that examine Dave as someone doing his best to ethically manage the people who report to him. In a lot of the episodes, we sympathize with Dave, who's been put in this very tough position, and it almost seems unfair that he has to take a certain brunt of the criticism that comes with it, such as in one episode titled Bitch Session, where he accidentally overhears everyone complaining about him.
Hey, Lisa, tell us the truth. Dave buys his suits in the little boys department, doesn't he?
I think he looks more like a very handsome young executive. And you guys have gone way, way over the line here.
You see, I'm from Wisconsin, where taxi cabs are feared and hunted for the delicious meat under their hoods.
Dave's reaction is very endearing.
Hello, Mom?
The episode was inspired by creator Paul Sims overhearing writers on the show complaining about him. The sympathy for Dave and, on rare occasions, Jimmy is what complicates NewsRadio in an interesting way. When we feel bad for these bosses, it reminds us of their humanity, and that the problem is less on them as individuals and more about the society we live in. Dave may have to be a hard ass on occasion, but he's still a decent guy with a humble upbringing trying to do his best. And Jimmy may toy with his employees, but it's not because he's a sociopath incapable of caring about others, rather because he lives in fabulous wealth and is disconnected from their tribulations, almost as if billionaires shouldn't be able to accrue so much wealth and power. This doesn't absolve either of them of the responsibility for the bad things that happen to the rest of the crew. Jimmy in particular can be quite harsh, but it makes them more than negative forces in the program. And I think part of the reason for that comes from their desire to be connected to the people they work with, in spite of how tough an obstacle the workplace makes it to become that family. An example of how desperate everyone is for connection is seen in the episode Rat Funeral, where the staff mourns the passing of an office rat, much like the mourning of a pet.
You have to understand, you've got a group of people here who work 16 hours a day. They're far from their families. The women are childless. And the men are, to put it delicately, lonely. Mike is many things to many people. To you, he's just a rat. But to the good people of this office, he's a member of the family.
I'm sorry, but not my family.
Exactly. Maybe you're not ready to be a member of our family.
The trappings of an office may twist and complicate our needs for community, but it can't erase it entirely. And that comes across in this need for rituals that strengthen feelings of connection between people in the office. The most obvious connection in the office between two characters is very clearly Lisa and Dave. In the first episode, there's a subtle hint that there might be something cooking between them.
Would you like to see the production booth?
Sure, that'd be great.
Well, hello, young lovers.
One of the goals Paul Simms had with the series was to buck some of the cliches in sitcoms at the time. So instead of doing the classic will they or won't they dynamic, a la Sam and Diane in Cheers, Dave and Lisa immediately hook up. We find out about that in the second episode of the series.
Lisa and I, we did it.
Rather than drag out the sexual tension, the series takes the approach that when two people are attracted to each other, they're more likely to just go for it. Or at the very least, it won't always turn into two people longing for one another from afar for months or years. So the long-running romantic tension in the series becomes how Dave and Lisa navigate their relationship in an office space where that secret is impossible to keep. Dave Foley credited creator Paul Simms for this idea, saying, "Paul's decision to do it that way, I thought, was great because it just seemed like we were past that point in our culture where the notion of whether or not two characters were going to sleep together was something to giggle about." Maura Tierney echoed this, saying, "I thought it was great because it was, again, very sort of non-traditional and irreverent to not make the audience wait. Paul was like, why string it out? He was more interested in seeing, and there was more comedy to be mined in watching the fallout of a reckless hookup." A boss dating someone who works for them is explored early on in the episode Goofy Ball when Jimmy finds out the truth.
Dave and I are having an affair.
Tell me, which one of you am I going to have to fire?
Jimmy chooses to pretend ignorance of this issue rather than enforce anything.
Mr. James, what if we just decided to keep this a secret?
Okay, let's go ahead and jump back in the Wayback Machine one more time. Hi, kids, how goes it?
Good.
So, you two having an affair?
No.
Good.
When the truth comes out to the rest of the office a few episodes later, in the episode The Breakup, Jimmy decides that instead of firing them, he's going to just let them fall apart in a few months.
If you think keeping a secret was hard, wait till you feel the pressure of the entire staff scrutinizing your every move. I give it about 3 months.
Mr. James, I really don't think that the staff cares as much about this as you think they do.
As time progresses, that professional pitfall is eventually overlooked to focus on the characters. It's part of how the series increasingly peels away the pretense of a professional environment to instead emphasize the relationships between each of the members of the ensemble. Dave and Lisa's relationship does eventually fall apart in the episode Physical Graffiti.
You're dumped.
No, you are dumped.
You are dumped.
No, you are dumped.
You are.
You're dumped. Oh, she's dumped.
A few episodes later, in the episode titled Led Zeppelin 2, Dave and Lisa get back together during a minor building fire.
So are you saying this whole building may collapse at any moment?
It's like 1 in 100 billion to 1 chance.
Well, a chance is still a chance. I think we ought to call the engineer.
Exactly. You dial and I'll talk.
This is a pattern that would repeat. The breaking up and getting back together, not the building fire. The first 2 seasons of NewsRadio were the most conventional. Though they had some commentary about connections formed in the workplace, it was within the relatively conventional presentation of your typical network sitcom. To be fair, it was being executed at a high level, complete with a strong cast and writing. But part of the reason NewsRadio is fondly remembered today is in part due to how it gradually began morphing into something else. While it was really season 3 where the transformation truly began, we did see subtle hints that the show could switch gears into something a bit different in the earlier episodes, such as in the season 1 episode Smoking, where Bill and Dave trade their respective vices of smoking and coffee. It's a fairly standard sitcom premise, where we see the two of them become increasingly irate as they can't get their typical fix, and Bill and Dave are constantly getting closer to cracking.
Matthew, what is it now? For God's sake, no one's smoking, okay? But nothing! You know what we need around here is an anti-whining ordinance. So just sip your sniveling little lip and haul your skinny ass out of here!
I don't think that qualifies as cracking, do you?
No.
This is one of the more memorable moments of the series and anticipates the sort of heightened comedy the show would really embrace as it went along. But getting to those later seasons would prove to be a challenge.
This one displeases me.
One of the heights of success on television in the 1990s was to be a hit series on a major network. It often brought money, fame, and occasionally critical acclaim. One of the challenges that came with trying to get there was dealing with a major network. A hit show can often flout the rules, or at least has a lot of leeway with their respective network. But shows that struggle in the ratings didn't have quite that level of grace, and NewsRadio was not a hit show. In its first and second seasons, NewsRadio's positions of 39th in the overall ratings placed it in the company of some of the lower-rated sitcoms on NBC. Although it began its run with a lot of promise, NewsRadio's ratings woes made it look to NBC as a show that needed fixing. The network would often make its feelings known through a series of notes, many of them often clashing with what the series was trying to do. In the DVD commentary for one episode, one of those notes was discussed.
That was another frequent network note about, let's see these people doing their job, let's see them doing their work, and I don't...
This was not a sitcom about people doing their jobs, and this note was not enthusiastically adopted by the writers. In fact, part of the culture of creating NewsRadio was for the show to do things its own way. And many times these notes would find their way into scripts, often being mocked or teased. This isn't to say the show was created without any sense of collaboration. All the actors and writers on the show have expressed in multiple interviews how open everyone was to suggestions. Unlike other shows where scripts were written in stone, suggestions for lines could be made by anyone, and some lines were even traded between actors. Paul Sims said in an article, "Too many shows, a writer sits down and creates characters and then bangs his head against the wall trying to make the actors do exactly what he wants. With this show, I cast people who I thought were funny, who made me laugh, and have given them a tremendous amount of leeway to do what they want." Stephen Root described it saying, "People from the page to a secretary could throw in an idea, and if it was funny, we'd use it." And that's attributed to Paul, because that doesn't really happen on a show. You stick to the script for the most part, and very few improvs get in. With our show, we would write for each other on the floor during the week, and a lot of that would get in. So it was an unusual and great situation that we all relished. Dave Foley was highlighted as being particularly proactive in suggesting new lines while rehearsing each episode. And Phil Hartman, in spite of being the biggest name on the show, was happy to give up lines to other actors if it would help out the episode or scene. The personalities of actors also inform the characters, such as Joe Rogan's interest in MMA or conspiracy theories shaping the character Joe, or Andy Dick's extreme personality making Matthew increasingly eccentric. That may be part of the reason why it felt like such a strong ensemble, because egos didn't matter as much as making the best show they could, and the actors were able to have a more direct role in shaping their characters. In spite of that camaraderie, there were tensions reported on the set. Joe Rogan and Andy Dick in particular, especially when the show began, were not always keen to work together.
I just never knew each week coming down to the set whether you guys were going to be in love or whether you were going to be fighting.
What? It was never bad. It was never where, like, if he ever yelled at me or I yelled at him or anything, we could always just hug. I'm sorry.
Funnily enough, it was that early tension between the two that inspired the writers to put them together in the episode titled The Cane, where Matthew suspects Joe hates him. According to writer Brad Isaacs, as soon as we did that script and that story, they became really good friends. They just sort of started liking each other after that. It was like taking whatever tension there was and throwing it out there and letting them play it out fictitiously. And doing that just took all of the tension away from the real people. While the network wasn't really part of this close-knit group, not all of their suggestions were ignored. In season 2, the Matthew character was increasingly involved in slapstick humor. It became customary for each episode to open with him falling down or hurting himself somehow. The network would request that fewer of these stunts be done, and it was mostly abandoned, though it would still happen on occasion in the later seasons. Another Matthew-related request from the network was that he not be called Spaz, likely due to the fact of that term being particularly hurtful in the UK. The American-based writing team was not aware of that cultural difference, so that term does unfortunately get used a lot in these early seasons.
But every now and again we, and by we, I mean the inconsiderate jerks who write this crap and then force me to say it, we like to kick back and say, what if?
Going into its third season, NewsRadio started leaning more towards its absurd storylines. Instead of the more grounded stories about work bonuses, we'd see things like Jimmy running for president.
Are you running for president just to meet women?
Yes. Yes, I am.
There was another weird story where we find that Dave is secretly a talented knife thrower.
Throw galley. Master of the throwing knife.
And there are even stranger moments, like when we see a brief moment of telepathy to close out one of the episodes.
You are a remarkable woman.
I know. But please stop pinching my butt in front of all these people.
What?
I can't believe Lisa's letting me get away with this.
This particular episode, Rose Bowl, was otherwise pretty normal, with a plot that had Dave tasking the staff to review each other, but it helps establish a pattern the show would often follow, ending on a bizarre moment, like characters communicating telepathically, or all the extras in the office being revealed as spies for Jimmy, or Dave doing a tap dance number on a table. On the further end of the spectrum of strange, though, we get the episode Daydream, where we see characters' daydreams triggered by a broken air conditioner on a hot day.
Can't get this thing working within the next half hour.
Each character's daydream reflects an interesting quirk in their personality, such as Lisa's fantasy of outsmarting Dave, reflecting the competitiveness of their relationship.
If the small man is so wise, then why is he so small?
Well,
Bill's fantasy is being a womanizer.
Okay, Bill?
And Matthew's fantasy is watching Bill be a womanizer.
Matthew.
Oh, yeah.
Beth's fantasies are probably the most abstract, as we see her being tormented by horror movie characters after having watched scary movies the night before.
Hey! Bill's asleep. Forever. But I'll play with you.
And much like other episodes, the strangeness builds, as Daydream ends on a very odd note, where we see Dave, apparently a construction worker, coming home to his wife, Lisa, while Jimmy sits on the floor staring at the office in a snow globe, presumably imagining the events of NewsRadio as he looks into it. This is a parody of the series finale to Saint Elsewhere, in which the series is revealed to have been imagined by the autistic son of one of the characters. Although some of the cast had never seen Saint Elsewhere, it was a favorite of Paul Simms. The premise for this episode was an excuse for flights of fancy that are one part character studies and one part absurd visuals. And as strange as Daydream was, it was only setting the stage for the Season 3 episode, Space, which brought the WNYX team into, well, space.
What if instead of reporting the news, we reported the space news?
The episode did more than place characters into spacesuits, though. It made use of surprisingly good special effects for a network sitcom. The episode also used a lot of fun references to sci-fi movies and TV shows. A lot of the comedy here was the juxtaposition of the radio newsroom setting and outer space. For example, when concerns about the budget pop up once again.
We are way over budget here. We're virtually hemorrhaging space dollars.
The budget concerns were often shorthand for a non-specific workplace topic of conversation, a topic that can be used in a variety of different ways, anything the plot really requires it to. It reflected how superficial much of the workplace aesthetics had become towards the end of the show's third season. It was certainly still part of the overall package, but it wasn't extremely important that it was a news radio station. Which is why in this episode, one of the proposed solutions to the space station's budget issues was to put people into suspended animation.
You don't need both Bill and Catherine reading the space news, right?
So what? You're gonna fire one of them?
No. Just put one of them in suspended animation for 50, 60 years. You don't have to work out the budget.
The idea for doing an episode in space was just a joke at first, and might have been a one-off experiment. But the next season brought an even more ambitious episode, Sinking Ship, which was inspired by the recent success of the movie Titanic.
What if WNYX wasn't a radio station at all, but rather a massive luxury liner called Titanic?
Whereas space was about a radio station in space, Sinking Ship is about a radio station on a luxury liner, shortly before it collides with an iceberg. While the effects in space were pretty good, Sinking Ship really raises the bar with a series of impressive visual effects and shots, my favorite one being the slow sinking we see as the office tilts towards the ocean.
If you don't like it, just give it. Well, then wear it. Why not? Look, it's a birthday present. It just means I'm glad you didn't die partway through the year.
And one of the final scenes has a picturesque parody of the final moments of Titanic. What makes this episode memorable is the spectacle of it, whereas that's common enough in big-budget movies, to see that in a sitcom was in stark contrast to other sitcoms that were airing at the time. The use of practical effects holds up really well. Even though this episode is over 25 years old, they're still visually very impressive. At the time, the episode was not a massive ratings hit, and it's hard to say how it could have been one. Titanic was a major movie at the time, but this type of parody was just not something that was seen in sitcoms of the day. Or at the very least, not so thoroughly that the parody ran through the entire episode. Sinking Ship stands as a testament not to what NewsRadio was, but rather what a sitcom could be.
You're obviously threatened by my ability to reach out to the common man in the language of the streets.
There was an exit early in the 4th season of NewsRadio, with Candy Alexander departing the show in the episode titled Catherine Moves On.
As of today, I'm leaving WNYX.
What?
And I just wanted to call this meeting to tell you all, and, well, let's say goodbye.
In an interview with Routers, Alexander explained why she was leaving, saying, "The auditions that I was getting were exactly like the job I was doing on NewsRadio. It was as if the work I was doing on ER was not being recognized, so the only things I was being allowed to audition for were small roles in comedies. It broke my heart. No one would see me for anything else. I knew in order to open up my career, I had to leave, or that's all I would ever be given." Her co-stars were a bit less diplomatic. On an early episode of Joe Rogan's podcast years later, Dave Foley said he believed the writing staff struggled to write for the character of Catherine.
A bunch of white guys from Harvard were not able to write for a black woman.
Looking at how Catherine was portrayed, that certainly has the sound of truth to it. She often got fewer lines than other characters, and even less in the way of storylines that focused on her. In one particularly interesting example of the character actually being used, this one from the Daydream episode, we see what Catherine's fantasy looks like.
No, it sure is nice to work in an office that has a few people of color in it.
You said you look like you could use a little company.
Oh, I'd be delighted, Eric.
Oh, great, thanks. Hey, did anybody see Friends last night?
Wouldn't miss it.
I love that.
What makes this particularly interesting is that the character Eric is played by Joe Fury, one of the writers for the series. The symbolism of Catherine imagining more representation on the show and not seeing it in the face of the white writer who breaks that fantasy is making a statement. While some of the writers have admitted to not using the character enough, not all the blame lies with them. There was an idea teased early in the series that Catherine and Joe might be getting together.
Oh my God, you like him.
This potential relationship was eventually squashed by the network, though, at least according to Dave Foley on one of the DVD commentaries.
There were 2 episodes that was going to build into a relationship between you two, but I think the network had a problem with...
Jungle Fever.
Yeah, one of you was black, and the other one wasn't.
Behind the scenes, it wasn't just Candy Alexander who was frustrated, though, and some of those other frustrations were also being driven by the network.
Well, screw you too.
Although the 3rd and 4th season of NewsRadio made some real efforts to stand out, its ratings continued to struggle. We started to see that be addressed within the show itself. In the episode The Real Deal, we see Bill's show, The Real Deal with Bill McNeil, struggling with ratings as well, and he decides to use the rating stunt of getting a major guest star to appear on his show, in this case Jerry Seinfeld. It's hard not to notice that NewsRadio is doing the exact same thing Bill was trying to do with his show, getting a major star like Jerry Seinfeld to be on it.
I'm a little concerned about the ratings.
This wouldn't be the only time the show openly worried about the ratings, though. In Daydream, it even went so far as to highlight one of the major culprits.
Well, as long as our ratings are good.
No, our ratings are not good. That's why Mr. James has decided to change the schedule.
Throughout the show's run, NewsRadio had 8 different time slots and was moved 10 times. It also has the distinct honor of being scheduled in all of the first 4 primetime slots on Wednesday evening, one of NBC's weakest nights of the week.
No, NewsRadio's moving to Wednesday.
Hello, friends. Hello, ER.
No, that's Thursday. NewsRadio is moving to Wednesday.
But I was specifically told.
Who told you that?
What?
Dave Foley reflected on this time slot chaos, saying, "The one thing that would have made a huge difference is if we were put in one time slot and left alone for a little while. I certainly know that I wouldn't change the way we did things." As I understand, it was a guy named Preston Beckman who was in charge of scheduling who didn't like the show and openly told a reporter from Entertainment Weekly that he didn't like the show. And the Entertainment Weekly reporter called up Paul and said, "You should know that I have this quote from your network." Phil Hartman also voiced his frustration around the scheduling.
My spirit is pretty much broken. I mean, at this point, I don't even want to be an actor anymore. I just want to go be a sailor. I want to be a frisbee thrower or something less painful.
From the network side of things, NBC President Warren Littlefield explained that NewsRadio was thought to be strong enough to help open up Wednesday nights for the network, but that scheduling change in the show's 3rd season brought over a 30% drop in the ratings. It went from the 39th most watched show on television to the 92nd. Littlefield publicly accepting some of the blame for the show's failures really backs up some of the complaints coming from the creative team, and there was one set of complaints that particularly struck a chord. Speaking to Rolling Stone in an interview that would become infamous, Paul Simms was very expressive with his frustrations about how the show continued to struggle in its 3rd season, and how the show was initially promised an alluring spot on NBC's Thursday nights. Here are a few excerpts from the interview. "The whole thing has been, you're a strong show. These other shows need help, so they need Thursday night, which is fine at first, but we've done 49 episodes and we're almost dead. We're the lowest rated NBC sitcom. They killed the show, basically. We had a meeting with Warren Littlefield the other day and I said, if this show went away and I tried to do a new one with the same cast and a different concept, there's like a 10% chance it would work as well as this. They told me in very blunt terms that it's not enough for a show to be well written and well acted anymore. It's about stars. I don't think viewers are stupid. People are starting to realize that Thursday night is like a big double-decker shit sandwich and 3 good pieces of bread, and in between. Don't print that. Are you sure? You know what? Go ahead. I don't give a shit anymore. It's like, what can they do to me? Oh, Saturday night? Fine. We are the lowest rated sitcom on NBC. It can't get any worse. And if it wasn't for Dark Skies or something, we'd be the lowest rated show on NBC. If NewsRadio doesn't last, would you turn your back on sitcoms? Yeah, this is the best I could do. Pretend you're God and you say, if you do a show about a single father who's dating a lot and has 2 teenage sons, and it doesn't have to be funny, and it'll be a huge hit, I'd say, F you, God. Simms would later say that this interview was a case of bad timing, as he was caught during a particularly frustrating moment while working on the show. Afterwards, he sent out handwritten apologies to people at NBC, but he expected his words to more or less mean the end of the series. Amazingly, though, NewsRadio was instead picked up for a 4th season and moved back to its original time slot of Tuesdays at 8:30 between Mad About You and Frasier. A New York Times article elaborates on it. After the interview was published, Mr. Littlefield approached Mr. Simms. I told him, yes, there was a possibility the show might be canceled, Mr. Littlefield said. But I said there was also a possibility that it could be saved, especially if he delivered 5 strong episodes at the end of the season. Mr. Littlefield said he was pleased with the final episodes. He delivered, he said of Mr. Simms. He did a number of things to bring more eyeballs to the show. And of the renewal decision and the new time slot, Mr. Littlefield added, we realize that the show right now just doesn't have that open up a time period stuff. But we felt it's still a signature show we believe in, so we have to find a satellite position for it. The Rolling Stone interview is such a strange inflection point for the series, as ordinarily such a public trashing of your boss usually gets you fired. But it does speak to NBC being aware of it failing a quality show. And it's one of the rare instances of a sitcom's creative staff blaming the network, and the network actually admitting that, yeah, they made some mistakes here. Speaking to the New York Times, Littlefield said, what we do is we incubate shows and then use them to open up time periods. The show had a good run, and we said, it's ready. Now let's move it to Wednesday. We did that, and then it died. Much like other things taken from the lives of the writers, the Rolling Stone interview also inspired an episode of NewsRadio. In the episode Mistake, Dave fears he might be fired after he trashes WNYX in an interview.
Staff, you mean my employees who are basically a well-intentioned but wholly inept group of bumblers? And that doesn't even sound like me.
Okay, so he misquoted you. I mean, that's
No,
to be
I said all
expected.
these things.
Oh.
NewsRadio's ratings improved in its 4th season, though the changes weren't dramatic. It rose from 92nd place in the ratings to 62nd, and ratings were up by about 13%. Its return to Tuesday did help, though it was tough for the show to transition into a hit when it was already 4 seasons into its run. Littlefield expressed some regret over the changes.
The question was, ultimately, we had a lot of mouths to feed, and we made a mistake. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. In retrospect, it probably just should have stayed parked right on Tuesday night.
That coveted Thursday time slot never did materialize aside from the occasional one-off show, but all the concern over where the show was placed ultimately didn't matter as much as another event that changed the fate of the series. Maura Tierney said in an interview, "If we had been on Thursday night, would there still have been that unfortunate tragic evening of what happened to Phil? That was the outcome of the show, regardless of what night we were on, it seems to me. So would it have changed anything? I don't know. It would have gotten more prizes, I guess, or more money, but it wouldn't have changed the outcome of what happened historically with us." On May 28, 1998, Phil Hartman was murdered by his wife, Bryn Hartman, who then took her own life a few hours later. This event reflects a bad relationship and substance abuse issues, but instead of teasing out the details on how Phil Hartman was the victim of a horrible crime, I think this video would spend its time better instead focusing on how Phil Hartman's talent impacted NewsRadio. One of the very best parts of NewsRadio was Phil Hartman. Although the show's cast was certainly an ensemble of talented people, there was something special about the Bill McNeil character. That really comes across in my favorite episode of the series, Season 4's The Public Domain, where we see Bill channel his inner Mark Russell, Mark Russell being a politically themed comedian who worked in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, singing parody songs while playing the piano. The title of the episode takes its name from the fact that the writing team had to use songs in the public domain for its political parodies to avoid having to pay licensing fees to more popular songs.
Oh, Joe Camel, oh, don't you cry for me. You gave my uncle cancer, but you'll pay the lawyer's fee.
Aside from his antics on the piano, Bill also takes part in the other plotline where Dave is afraid his job is going to be given away to a guy named Steve. Luckily for Dave, Bill has a plan to get rid of Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Hello, Bill. How are you?
That was your plan?
I panicked.
In Sinking Ship, we see Phil Hartman being absolutely fantastic in what would be his final appearance on the show.
The wealthy aristocracy are simply not meant to mingle with the vulgarian bourgeois swine of third class. It just isn't done.
For as great as he was in front of the camera, all the stories I found while researching this video show Phil Hartman to be an absolute joy behind the scenes as well, which made his passing even more difficult for all the people who knew him. Without Phil Hartman, it seemed like NewsRadio wouldn't be able to continue. It had been renewed shortly before his death, and the decision was made for it to continue without him. Dave fully described how that decision came about in an interview. "We all went to Paul's house for a wake for Phil with the cast and crew. Everyone was debating. It was a discussion as to whether or not we should do another season. As Toncherona said, in reference to Bryn, she's taken enough away. Don't let her take each other away." That was the argument that won everyone over. It's bad enough that we miss Phil as much as we do. Let's not have to miss each other as well. I think it was a good decision, and I'm certainly glad we had that extra time together. The first episode of the 5th season, titled Bill Moves On, addresses the absence on the show. In the context of the series, it was explained that Bill had recently passed from a heart attack. The episode manages to find a bit of laughter with a running joke about Dave's eulogy underwhelming the mourners.
Hello, everyone.
Your eulogy was the best.
Thanks, but it really wasn't.
It was totally comprehensive.
It didn't suck at all.
And Candy Alexander returned as Catherine for a special cameo. The rest of the episode focuses on the cast reading letters from Bill to each of them in a very difficult scene to watch, as the cast is clearly struggling with their grief.
Farewell. Take care of each other, and I'll see you all when you get to wherever it is that I am now.
The final shot of the episode is the empty space where Bill's desk once was. Talking about the episode, Dave Foley said, "To be there where we spent so much time with Phil, to be given the opportunity to mourn Phil together as part of the show, mourning Phil and mourning the character he created, it was very emotional. If you watch that episode, you can see that we're all really crying in the scene. It really was the first time, in front of the audience, everyone let themselves confront what they were feeling. It was a very raw moment." As far as episodes go dealing with an actor tragically dying during a show's production, this was one of the most moving. There was no attempt at recasting or sending the character off on some faraway journey. It gave the characters and the actors the space to explore a subject like grief. And the small touches of comedy reveal how necessary a laugh can be when struggling through moments of sadness. The final shot of the space left by Bill's absence, and also Phil's, emphatically shows us how much more he made the series by being a part of it. And it's an absence that wouldn't be so easily filled.
A lone man reaches out for help and finds Bill McNeil.
The decision to continue News Radio brought with it a need to find someone to complete the ensemble. John Lovitz was decided as the most suitable fit for the role. Lovitz had previously appeared on 2 episodes of News Radio, playing the characters Fred and Mike, though a better reason as to why he was thought to be joining the cast was because of the long friendship he had with Phil Hartman. Lovitz was in fact partially responsible for Hartman's career taking off the way it did after he got him an audition for Saturday Night Live. Speaking to the New York Times about taking the job at News Radio, Lovitz recounted talking to Brad Gray, Lovitz's manager and an executive producer on the show. "I said to Brad, they better not come to me to replace Phil. The show wasn't doing that well, and I just thought me joining it would be manipulative. I thought I'd be profiting from his death, and I didn't want to face the fact that he was gone. So I said it to Brad, never thinking they would offer it to me in a million years. I didn't even think they should continue with the show." Paul Simms asked for Lovitz directly to be a part of the show, though Lovitz wasn't immediately convinced. In the New York Times article, he continued saying, "Paul Simms said, because Phil was murdered, I don't want the show murdered. That made sense to me. That got to me." Finally, at a memorial service, Mr. Hartman's mother approached Mr. Lovitz. His mother said to me, "Thank you for picking up the flag." When she said that, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. "If people are going to compare me, I can't please them all," he said. "I don't care. I'm the first to say I'm not as good as Phil. I'm different from him. I can't do what he did, so I'll just do my thing." John Lovitz would debut as Max Lewis on the 2nd episode of Season 5 titled Meet the Max Lewis. Max Lewis was a stark departure from Bill. Whereas Bill was pompous, Max was insecure. Bill had a natural charm, while Max was a bundle of anxiety. It's hard to imagine these characters as friends, though you can at least tell there was some real affection when Max speaks about him.
Were you guys very close?
Oh, yeah. Great guy.
Max would never be quite as large a part of the show as Bill was, but he was a major factor in shaping News Radio's 5th and final season.
Well, how could she do that to me, Lisa? How could she French your daddy?
Ahead of the Season 5 premiere, NBC aired a special program called Primetime Preview that I think reveals how little faith they had in News Radio at the time. The special goes night by night, offering brief rundowns of each of NBC's show for that season, both new and returning. Most shows got roughly 30 seconds to a minute, while bigger hits like Friends were given several minutes to tease their new season. Here's what the News Radio preview looked like.
News Radio is back for another season, too, and one of America's favorite comedians, John Lovitz, is stepping up to the mic.
You're probably wondering, now, how did he get the part? It was down to 2 people. Me and Oprah Winfrey. News Radio.
Not only was it one of the shorter previews, it also featured almost no footage from the actual show, not the strongest vote of confidence from NBC. One of the major plot lines that ran through Season 5 is the romance between Lisa and Johnny Johnson, played by Patrick Warburton. Johnny shows up after Jimmy has to go on the run after the FBI figures out he is the infamous D.B. Cooper, a man who, in 1971, hijacked a plane and then disappeared with $200,000 in ransom, roughly worth $1.5 million in 2024. With Jimmy in the wind, Johnny is trying to seize his corporate empire, and Johnny is interested in a little more than that.
You don't have to work in a rose garden to recognize an American beauty.
Warburton would stick around for several episodes and played a part of the marketing for these episodes. making it seem like he was probably requested by NBC, or at the very least, and someone NBC was happy to see on the show as they helped market it via a Seinfeld connection.
Jimmy's in jail. Could it be that Seinfeld guy put him there?
I can't turn my back on this place.
Having broken up with Dave recently, Lisa quickly gets close with Johnny, and he proposes to her in the very next episode.
I really think second base is my limit right now.
Lisa Miller, light of my life, fire of my loins. Will you marry me?
But in the episode after that, Jimmy manages to escape the charges against him by having Adam West admit that he's actually D.B. Cooper, and then Jimmy ousts Johnny from his company.
You mean you're actually giving up?
Well, I had to, sweetness. The man beat me fair and square.
But you're evil.
It's no excuse for poor sportsmanship.
But Johnny appeared in more than those 3 episodes as he returns a few months later, now a wino, but still trying to marry Lisa.
You're a smelly homeless drunk.
We prefer the term wino.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'm not big on that PC stuff myself. I'm a changed man, Lisa, and I come to make good on my promise. I want you to be my wife.
No kidding.
Johnny convinces Lisa with a very potent kiss, and this leads to a wedding episode. Weddings being a favorite of networks in an effort to juice ratings.
You are my sunshine. My only sunshine. And well, hey, you rock my world.
Sadly, Johnny would have to spend his honeymoon, and quite a bit longer, behind bars. In the midst of all this corporate intrigue and romance, and a clear effort to please their network overlords, the character of Lisa feels a bit lost. What should have been a story to place her in the spotlight is too centered on what Johnny is up to, and various stunts and theatrics like guest stars and a sudden wedding. Lisa's previous major concern, her relationship with Dave from earlier seasons, reveals how much of her overarching storylines involve who she's dating. Lisa is a lot more complex than that would suggest. She's the only genuinely great reporter on the team, which we see in a couple of episodes, a savant when it comes to math, and has a very ambitious personality. But aside from the episodes where she briefly assumes control of the newsroom, most of her larger arcs are about her love life. Even that brief stint as the news director was because she and Dave swapped jobs, so it's ultimately tied to her relationship with him. While Lisa felt a bit pigeonholed as a character, she was easily the most developed woman on the cast, though. On a podcast, Vicki Lewis mentioned that the women on the show sometimes felt like they didn't have the most substantial of stories.
I certainly wanted, if I'm honest, there to be some meatier B stories. Probably all the women did at some point.
Mm-hmm. While Beth was always a fun character, she was also one that felt adrift, getting up to wacky antics in a number of episodes, though not a whole lot more than that. But there was an episode in season 5 where we see her standing up to Jimmy that gave her a chance to shine, teasing the possibility that Beth could be a real force in the office. In Spooky Rapping Crypt, Beth is requesting a profit-sharing plan for employees, and Jimmy, who was planning to offer that plan himself, doesn't want to look weak by accepting her proposal. Rather, he thinks the profit-sharing idea needs to come from him.
You want to negotiate?
Bring it on.
All right, fine.
I will bury you!
What was that?
Oh, just standard opening move. Not your turn. Go ahead.
Seeing Beth rise to the occasion and prove a match for Jimmy, all the while their friendship hangs in the balance, gives her character some much-needed growth.
This is about justice and doing what's right. I am fighting for the American dream, damn it!
The American dream is profit sharing.
No, Dave. The American dream is a six-pack and a subscription to Playboy. But how are we going to get there without profit sharing?
Beth is punching above her weight class as the secretary standing up to her boss's boss, and it reflects how her strident attitude is turning her into someone who will stand up for everyone in the office. And had the series continued, it would have been interesting to see where this new powerhouse Beth might have gone. This episode is one of the brighter spots of season 5 and revealed the show still had some potential for quality. The more absurd elements, of course, were still very much present, as seen in the episode Hair, where Joe hypnotizes Jimmy to go into his dreams to discover why Jimmy is afraid of hippies. Things get even weirder when Matthew somehow enters the dream and gets turned into a chicken. There's a real sense of chaos in the 5th season, though. Everything feels slightly off, and not in the way previous seasons had, where it seemed like the show was exploring strange new places. Rather, the feeling here is a show that's lost a bit of control, has lost a part of itself. It's here we realized how essential Phil Hartman was to the chemistry and balance of this series. These zany characters had a very close-knit bond, and with one of them gone, the balance is thrown off, and the show feels adrift. Maura Tierney reflected on the 5th season, saying, "Ultimately, do I think that was our best work? No. But I wasn't a part of that, and I don't decide whether we do another season or not. Looking back, I think it was difficult for John Lovitz to come into that. I was terribly mean to him for a while, until my mother said to me, 'Don't be mean.' I believe she said to me, 'Don't be a bully.' So it was hard, but we did it. We got through it. I'm sure there were some good shows." The ratings for the 5th season were not great. Finding itself once again on Wednesday nights, it struggled to build an audience, and it fell from 62nd in the rankings to 77th. It returned to Tuesday for the second half of the season, but NewsRadio would be canceled in its 5th season. The final episodes of the series have Jimmy announcing that he's selling the station and moving to New Hampshire, but since he doesn't want to leave his friends behind, he makes them all job offers to go with him. It all unfolds in the series finale titled New Hampshire.
Will you pay us the same up there that you pay us here?
Oh, sure.
You know what? I don't want to give up my apartment.
No, but I would be willing to pay for your apartment while you're up there.
Mine too?
Yeah.
No! Nobody gets to go but Matthew.
As Jimmy assembles the staff, he expects that will be enough to convince holdout Dave to go with them.
I wouldn't waste too much time saying goodbye to Dave. I have a feeling we're going to be seeing him again real soon.
When will that be, sir?
That would be when you come to your senses and realize you're passing up the opportunity of a lifetime. Come on, people.
But instead, we see goodbyes between Dave and most of the rest of the cast.
We all knew this day would come eventually. I suppose it's nice that so many of you will be staying together.
Bye, Dave.
Yeah, I'll see you, Dave.
Bye, Dave.
The other holdout is Matthew, who has decided to stay behind with Dave, much to Dave's chagrin.
It's me and you, pal. Me and you forever.
I know.
As far as series finales go, this one didn't seem to quite fit the mold. And that's probably because while it was written suspecting it might be the series finale, there was a hope that maybe there might be another miracle and the show might have gotten a 6th season. In fact, as a sign of that optimism, several pages were written for what would have been the 6th season premiere, but they ultimately never saw the light of day. The NewsRadio podcast, Dispatches from Fort Awesome, got a hold of these script pages and revealed what they contained. The 6th season premiere moved the series forward a few months into the future, with Dave still in New York City, surrounded by a new team. And Matthew. And then suddenly, Dave receives a call from Jimmy. And that's all we will likely ever know about what happens next.
This isn't Good Morning Bumwad County with Cindy Lee and Melvin.
Following NewsRadio, Dave Foley made numerous appearances in TV and film, including several The Kids in the Hall reunions. Most recently, he appeared in the 5th season of Fargo, playing the character Danish Graves. Maura Tierney went from NewsRadio to a regular role in ER as the character Abby Lockhart, which earned her an Emmy nomination. She appeared in several other programs and movies as well, with her most recent role being Doris Von Erich in The Iron Claw. Stephen Root would appear in Office Space during NewsRadio's final season, and also continued to voice the character of Bill on King of the Hill until 2010. He appeared in several movies by the Coen brothers, and most recently was nominated for an Emmy in the HBO series Barry, where he played Monroe Fuchs. After leaving NewsRadio, Candy Alexander continued to work on ER, and then later went on to appear in the HBO miniseries The Corner, which later led into the series The Wire. Although Alexander didn't appear in that series, she was in another David Simon project, Treme. She would later receive an Emmy nomination for her performance on Scandal as the character Maya Pope. Vicki Lewis appeared in TV and film for many years, though her highest profile job was probably the roles of Deb and Flo in the Pixar movie Finding Nemo. Outside of acting on screen, she also released her first solo album, East of Midnight, in 2010, and she has been appearing on stage, recently in a production called Between the Lines. Joe Rogan went on to work as a UFC commentator and hosting the reality TV program Fear Factor. Although he would act in several other roles and have a few comedy specials, he's certainly most well known today for his very popular podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, which mixes casual conversations about conspiracy theories with dangerous misinformation that spreads right-wing propaganda. Andy Dick launched The Andy Dick Show for MTV that ran for 3 seasons, and then the reality TV parody, The Assistant. He's also appeared in a number of movies and TV shows throughout the years, although he more frequently makes headlines after a series of high-profile arrests, often involving substance abuse and sexual assault. During filming of the 5th season, the set was not universally welcoming to Jon Lovitz, and there was at least one unfortunate confrontation between Lovitz and Andy Dick. According to Lovitz in an interview years later, Dick had been particularly harsh to him on set, saying he was unwanted, to which Lovitz responded that it was Dick's fault that he had given Phil Hartman's wife Brynn cocaine, ultimately leading to Phil's murder. Although the two made up afterwards, a pair of encounters years later would see Lovitz attacking Dick, slamming his head against the bar. The cast of NewsRadio has largely gone their own ways, reuniting on occasion in a variety of different projects. A 2015 reunion at Sketchfest in San Francisco is the most recent photo I could find with several members of the cast together, although sadly a few important faces are missing as both Maura Tierney and Vicki Lewis had to cancel their scheduled appearance. In spite of the show's limited audience at the time, the cast does talk about the show with a lot of fondness for one another and the creative freedom they found on the set, and in spite of the difficulties in creating the show, it appears to have been a positive experience for them. As for the legacy of the show in the wider world, that's a tougher question to answer. Had NewsRadio been a bigger hit, we might have seen workplace sitcoms move in its direction, with absurd storylines and a heightened sense of reality. We might have seen a workplace sitcom that dug deeper into the idea of the absurdness of a workplace being where you make a family, and how that dynamic, as a lens through our understanding of how we see work, would provide some interesting satire. Instead, with the rise of shows such as The Office, we saw a different, more grounded approach to the workplace sitcom, favoring realism while still using the same theme of a workplace family, but that absurdity was instead replaced by a sentimentality that didn't quite have the same bite. NewsRadio is one of those shows that probably made more of an impact in the critical space than anywhere else, regularly showing up in lists of the best sitcoms of the 90s, and certainly one that was underrated while it was airing. If it's going to have any legacy going forward, it would be in its role in influencing any sitcom that put people in a place where a family can be found and taking them on strange journeys through a heightened sense of reality. Reflecting on the experience, Stephen Root said, "It was a seminal time in my life, certainly one that ruined me for other sitcoms because there's only so much fun you could have, and that show was pretty much it." Dave Foley said, "I had so many great times on Friday nights after we would finish shooting, and we would all hang out. We would go to a bar that was right next door to the studio. Then usually when they would close down, we would all go back to the lot and hang out in the prop room, one of our dressing rooms, and everyone would hang out till dawn, just hanging out and having a good time together. That's an experience I'm not going to replicate in my life again." I have to hold up my hand as someone who missed NewsRadio when it was first airing back in the 90s. It was a much better show than I expected from those, honestly, dopey promos NBC would put together for it. The cast and the writing were so much stronger than a lot of the other programs that populated the primetime landscape of the 90s. If you're looking for the show, it shouldn't be too tough to find, and it's not nearly as long as many of the other shows I've covered, so do look out for it if you get the chance. But if you're looking to watch another video like this one, perhaps you should like, comment, and most of all, subscribe to this channel so you're aware of other future sitcom retrospectives that I do. Or if there are any of my older ones you haven't seen, check out a playlist I've made of all those videos so you can learn everything you wanted to know about your favorite classic TV sitcoms. And if you want to ensure more of these are made in the future, do become a patron or channel member like the fine names you see on the screen now. You get early access to videos and some extra bonuses I like to throw in as well. Thank you all so much for watching.